Power doesn't usually collapse with a shout or a scandalous confession. It cracks when someone calmly explains how the system really works, and that is exactly why this moment landed like an earthquake across South Africa and far beyond its borders. Because what was said on live television didn't sound reckless or emotional. It sounded prepared, measured, and disturbingly familiar to anyone who has ever watched corruption hide behind procedure and paperwork. For years, South Africans were told a reassuring story about renewal, stability, and clean governance, a story repeated so often that it became almost instinctive to believe it. Yet in a single broadcast, that story was placed next to documents, timelines, and financial trails that refused to sit comfortably with the official version. And suddenly the question wasn't whether something felt wrong, but how long people had been trained not to look too closely. What made this moment impossible to dismiss was not drama or outrage, but precision, the kind that forces even loyal supporters to pause. Because Mkhwanazi didn't speak in slogans or suspicions. He spoke in dates, transactions, corporate structures, and regulatory outcomes, the language of people who have spent years inside systems most citizens never see. And hearing that kind of language used on public television changes how accusations are received. There is a reason his words carried weight, and it has little to do with political ambition and everything to do with proximity to power, because Mkhwanazi is not an outsider shouting from the margins. He is someone who spent nearly 2 decades navigating the machinery of governance, watching how decisions are framed for the public while entirely different conversations happen behind closed doors. And that background matters when assessing credibility. When someone like that says the public story doesn't align with the internal reality, it forces an uncomfortable reassessment, not just of one leader, but of an entire era of political reassurance, and it raises a question many viewers found themselves asking in silence. If this version of events fits so neatly with things that never quite made sense before, why were those questions never fully answered? At the center of the controversy is not a single transaction or a scandal, but a network, a long-running pattern of relationships between political authority and private capital that stretches back decades, long before the presidency, long before the speeches about reform, and long before the promise of a clean break from the past became the dominant narrative sold to voters and investors alike. According to the evidence presented, these were not reckless or obvious moves. They were structured, layered, and deliberately complex, using shell companies, trusts, and intermediaries spread across jurisdictions in ways that are technically lawful on the surface, but deeply troubling when viewed as a whole, and that distinction is important. Because corruption in modern states rarely looks like a suitcase of cash exchanged in a dark room. One of the most unsettling aspects of the revelations was how familiar the patterns looked to investigators who have studied financial crimes across the continent. Money moving just slowly enough and just indirectly enough to avoid triggering alarms, assets registered under names that require persistence to trace, and benefits that only become visible when policy outcomes are placed next to ownership structures. For many viewers, this suddenly reframed years of puzzling policy decisions, choices that analysts struggled to justify at the time, regulatory frameworks that seemed oddly specific, and reforms that promised competition but somehow produced new monopolies connected to the same small circle of interests. And it leaves a simple but uncomfortable question hanging in the air. Were these really mistakes, or were they perfectly designed? The narrative of Ramaphosa as a reformer has always leaned heavily on contrast, the idea that he represented a moral and institutional reset after years of state capture scandals, and for a long time that contrast was enough, because people wanted to believe in recovery. They wanted a reason to trust again, and belief can be a powerful anesthetic when accountability feels exhausting. But belief becomes fragile when confronted with records, especially when those records suggest that the systems enabling corruption were never dismantled, only reorganized, with different beneficiaries and cleaner language. And that is where the anger many people feel today comes from, not just betrayal, but the realization that hope itself may have been strategically managed. The Fela scandal already cracked the surface of this illusion, raising unanswered questions about foreign currency, reporting obligations, and private security responses that didn't align with ordinary standards. And while the story faded from daily headlines, it never truly went away, lingering as an unresolved anomaly in the public record. What Mkhwanazi suggested is that this incident was not an exception, but an accidental exposure, a moment when a much larger system briefly became visible, and that interpretation forces a reevaluation of details many people stopped questioning, including how assets were acquired, how renovations were financed, and how cash could circulate outside normal banking channels without immediate consequence. Investors notice too, not because they are moral arbiters, but because political uncertainty is a financial risk, and markets respond quickly to credibility shocks, which raises another question worth thinking about. How many economic decisions are quietly driven by confidence? Legally, the situation sits in a gray zone that exposes weaknesses in accountability frameworks because much of what has been alleged involves actions. Even if prosecutions never materialize, the revelations challenge the effectiveness of existing investigative bodies, asking why so many patterns went unexamined for so long, and whether independence on paper is enough when political pressure shapes priorities, budgets, and career trajectories behind the scenes. Former investigators speaking about stalled cases and blocked inquiries add another unsettling layer, because if oversight mechanisms selectively avoid powerful figures, then corruption is no longer an aberration. It becomes a managed feature of governance, something tolerated as long as it remains orderly and discreet. What may be most damaging in the long term is not any single allegation, but the collapse of moral contrast, because when reformers are shown to operate within similar incentive structures as those they replaced, public trust erodes faster and deeper, and cynicism becomes the default political language. As viewers process all of this, many are left with quiet, persistent questions rather than clear conclusions, questions about how much they truly know, about what accountability should look like, and about whether democracy can function when transparency depends on whistleblowers rather than institutions. This story does not end with a verdict or a resignation. It lingers in the uncomfortable space between documentation and denial, between belief and proof, and as South Africans move toward a defining political moment, the unresolved tension may be the most powerful force of all, because once people start seeing patterns instead of promises, they rarely unsee them. And that realization has a way of reshaping history long after the broadcast lights go dark.